Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to do a scene in charcoal, but I'm going to use some unconventional methods for applying charcoal to the paper. I'm going to use this piece of willow charcoal and I'm going to grind it on this piece of sandpaper to get a little bit of that residue, to get a bit of charcoal dust. And then I'm going to be dipping in some of my blending tools into that and just basically painting with that. Because charcoal is such a material that you can draw with it if you're using charcoal sticks or charcoal pencils, or you can paint with it if you use brushes or some other blending tools, even your fingers. So first I tried working a little bit with a brush, and that was a little bit slow and a little bit uneven. So I started applying a piece of paper towel. I would just dip that piece of paper towel into that charcoal dust and then apply it onto the paper. Let me just explain the idea behind this scene. I want to create a layered scene with a feeling of depth, where some of the objects, namely the canopies, the foliage in the distance, would be a lot lighter, and the ones that are closer would be getting darker and more defined, more detailed, with more contrast and texture. So basically I'm going to be creating tension and contrast in value between the objects in the foreground and those which are further back. And I'm going to be building up the scene by starting from these lightest, most vague looking objects in the background to the better defined, darker, well fleshed out objects in the foreground. But we'll get to that. Anyway, let's say a few words about the materials. I'm working on a Fabriano drawing paper, about 9 times 12 inches in size. I'm going to be working with some pieces of willow charcoal, and I'm going to be creating charcoal dust from them. In addition to the willow charcoal, I'm also going to be using woodless charcoal pencils, and I'm going to be using a variety of blending tools. So once I have these distant canopies, which are barely visible, I'm going to draw some darker layers on top of that. Here on the left side, I'm going to put down a bit more charcoal. So as you can see, I'm still using the same technique. I'm applying the charcoal by using the paper towel, and I'm trying to imitate the appearance of multiple canopies of trees and bushes. But these are a bit better defined, and they're a little bit darker. They're closer to our viewpoint. And as you can see, all I have to do to produce this is just dip the paper towel into a little bit more charcoal. I keep creating the charcoal dust by grinding the willow charcoal stick onto the sanded paper. Here I'm just refining the appearance of those canopies in the background a little bit by poking some holes in them, like maybe there's a little bit of light coming through. These differences in value are very subtle, and they're going to be barely noticeable once I draw a whole bunch of elements in front of these. But so far the scene looks good. I'm going to keep adding some darker elements in front of these. I'm going to need this piece of paper, glassine paper, to put under my hand, because there's going to be more smudging now as I keep adding more and more charcoal. Now, as you can see, I'm not working with a paper towel anymore, and now I'm working with this willow charcoal stick. So I'm switching to the drawing phase of the process, and I'm actually making some more deliberate marks, trying to imitate the appearance of foliage. So this is going to be like a small bush or a group of bushes that are closer to the foreground, closer to our viewpoint. This is already a part of the midground, if you will. So you can see this one is darker, a little bit better defined in terms of shape. There's also even a little bit of texture on it. I'm going to draw another group of bushes and maybe some low trees to the left. And these are going to be about the same value as the ones in the middle. I'm just going to blend those in with a brush, and because some parts of that background group of trees is a little bit lighter in the lower area, I'm just going to use whatever residue charcoal dust I have and push it onto that lighter area. The good thing about brushes is that you can spread the charcoal dust around without ruining all of the marks and the textures, so they don't blend that thoroughly. You can see you can soften the shapes, you can soften the marks, but those marks are still there. Now I'm going to start adding some foliage here at the top. I'm going to make it look like there are some branches and some foliage kind of overarching the scene from both sides. And I'm adding some slightly lighter shapes. First I used a combination of a paper towel and now a tortilla for some smaller marks, smaller shapes. So as I always say, your tortilla can also be used as a drawing tool. When it picks up a little bit of charcoal, you can use it to draw some lighter and maybe less defined marks. Now I'm going to draw some tree trunks here. Again, I have to switch to that piece of willow charcoal, because whenever I need more precision and whenever I need to make slightly more deliberate and cleaner marks, I'm going to switch to either a piece of willow charcoal or a pencil. Willow charcoal is soft natural charcoal that comes in these sticks of irregular shape, usually fairly thin sticks. It's the same thing with vine charcoal. Vine charcoal or willow charcoal doesn't really matter. You can even make this type of charcoal yourself by burning thin pieces of wood, twigs and stuff like that. And the good thing about this type of charcoal is that it can be easily manipulated, it can be easily blended, modified. But you can also sharpen these sticks and use them more like a pencil. So I drew a bunch of branches here to make these tree trunks look a little bit more realistic and a bit more complex. So I'm drawing another tree to the left. This one is again slightly in front of the other one. And a bunch of branches. Branches can be a little bit tricky depending on what you use to draw them. But you can manage with whatever you're using. My trick is usually because they have to taper and they have to sort of change their direction because they're growing every which way and bending every which way. So sometimes I start from the thinner part and go all the way to the base, and sometimes I go over the thicker part twice, and that actually gives me a more realistic looking branch. But I also have to cover some of them partly with a little bit of foliage. And right now I'm drawing the foliage so that it's not too dark, because I'm going to be drawing some branches and foliage which is even closer to our viewpoint, so in front of these. And that's going to give me an additional feeling of depth. And to draw the foliage, my technique is more or less the same as I always use. I just make a bunch of small irregular marks using either a charcoal pencil or a piece of willow charcoal. Here, willow charcoal is better for this. Now when they don't need to be too well defined or when they don't need to be too dark, I just use blending tools on top of them to soften them a little bit, and that gives me that illusion of volume and density. I'm adding a little bit more charcoal powder by grinding down that willow charcoal stick. And now I'm going to dab the top right side of the paper, the top right part of the scene with that piece of paper towel, and apply a little bit of charcoal powder there in such a manner so that I already get shapes that kind of look like clusters of leaves. So if you just drag the paper towel, you will blend it too evenly. I want to dab it in such a way so that I end up with shapes that kind of look like groups of leaves. These are again a little bit lighter. Maybe they're a little bit too light. If they end up being too light, maybe I will try to make them a bit darker, or maybe I will just draw some darker foliage in front of it. So there are a lot of options, and you can always modify certain aspects of your scene as you go along. But now I'm drawing the tree trunk and a little bit of those branches. You can see the shape of the tree trunk is kind of interrupted in a couple of places. That's because I want some parts of it to be obscured by the foliage. So some parts of the tree trunk are more visible than others. Another thing that you see me doing every now and then is I go back and I try to clean up the shape of some of these parts of the tree trunk, even on the left side where I already pretty much finished that part of the scene. The reason is because even though they are of lighter value, they still need to have clean edges against the rest of the background, which is not easy when you're working in willow charcoal. But I'm doing the best I can to clean up those edges so that I would have clean shapes of those trees and branches. Here on this right side, we're going to have a darker area, like a shadow area, under that group of trees on the right. So I'm just drawing that tree trunk and a little bit of foliage, making sure that the shape of the tree trunk is again pretty clean, and that there is a fairly clean edge to value. It's not perfect, but it's good enough to satisfy the eye of the viewer, I suppose. And I'm gonna layer this part of the bushes here at the bottom by making this part here even darker than the one behind it. So I keep adding darker and darker and more defined layers, one in front of the other. And by stacking the elements in such a manner, I am creating a feeling of depth, because every time I draw a more defined darker element in over or in front of another one, I'm kind of managing to push the other elements back further into the background and create a feeling in a viewer that these lighter elements are way back. So it's all about creating a feeling of depth and distance. I added a few more branches on the right. And now I'm going to add a few more here around this tree. You can see that as I was sharpening one of my pencils to create that dust, I left the residue on the left on that lower portion of the paper. I'm not going to use it right now. I'm going to use it a little bit later. No rush, because I'm not going to smudge it now. But you can see that I drew some nice looking branches here in front of that tree. And the foliage that I'm drawing now is a bit darker and a bit larger in size, both the individual leaves and the clusters of leaves. That's because I want to suggest to the viewer that these are in front of that tree, that they're a little bit closer to our viewpoint. So this is pretty much typical charcoal scene. I've done many of those. The only slight difference in the approach is that here maybe I used a little bit less of the charcoal pencils and the traditional drawing methods, and I used a little bit more of the charcoal dust and charcoal residue by using more of a painterly approach, as you can see, by trying to spread the charcoal dust with my blending tools, either using a brush or a paper towel or some other methods. Now I'm cleaning up some of these shapes of branches and working on top of this foliage here to soften it a little bit and to make it look a bit more dense. And I can just keep adding more if I'm not entirely happy with the texture, with the appearance, with the shapes and stuff like that. The trick, I think, is to vary the size of your marks, the direction of those marks, the shape of them, and when you have that type of that sort of randomness, that makes the foliage look a bit more realistic. Can't really help you any more than that, because you just have to practice and do the best that you can. I'm not saying that mine is perfect. Sometimes it just comes out a little bit better, sometimes not so good, but practice and practice, I suppose. Anyway, I'm moving on to the foreground area and to the bottom part of the scene. I'm adding more value. We're going to have like a small stream here in the middle. The reason why I want this stream here is because I want a lighter area which will create a sort of a balance with the lighter area in the upper part of the scene, the sky, which is not obscured by any of the branches or the foliage. And I'm going to have some of the those lighter values in the sky reflected in the water as well. I'm just adding some darker areas here at the bottom of these bushes to make them appear a bit more three-dimensional, a bit more defined. And I'm also going to have to be throwing in a little bit more of the charcoal pencil here as I'm starting to work on the foreground, because the foreground is going to have more and more of those darker details, as well as some smaller, finer details which I can only do, or which are maybe easier to do with a charcoal pencil. You can see that I'm already creating a very nice range of value as I'm adding a little bit of charcoal pencil at the time, and I'm also I'm achieving a lot more of that illusion of detail, because as you drag the charcoal pencil it creates some unpredictable marks, unpredictable textures, and that's what you want for those foreground areas, because you can't really draw every single stone, every single dip in the terrain, every single blade of grass. You want something that will help you create that illusion of detail in a quick and random manner. So here I sort of realized that the upper part of the scene was a little bit too light, and I decided to throw in a little bit more foliage and branches in front of it. So as I already explained, I'm going for a layered scene, and now I'm just adding another layer of elements onto my scene. These will be in front of those canopies in the back. So it's all about creating a feeling of depth in that forest. I'm repeating the same process by drawing a lot of these small marks with a piece of willow charcoal. This takes a little bit of patience if you don't want to end up with an ugly looking texture and foliage that doesn't really look very convincing. Because if you want to make it look convincing, you have to make quite a few of those marks. And another thing, you kind of want to group them together a little bit, so you don't want to make just a bunch of dots. It's a little bit more complex than that. So for the sake of balance, I'm going to add some more branches popping into the foreground from both sides. I'm going to add some of them here on the left as well, and I'm going to add a little bit of foliage to them as well. And I'm doing all of this with a piece of willow charcoal again. So I'm just going to add some more here at the top. As you can see, I'm varying the size, the shape and the concentration a little bit because in some places we're going to have like a larger, more dense cluster of foliage. In other places we're going to have just a few leaves which are kind of detached from the rest of the group. This randomness is what helps to create a more natural looking foliage. And I'm just dabbing here on this charcoal dust and then trying to pull some lighter details, some random lighter marks, like maybe these are some, I don't know, stones or raised bits of dirt or some blades of grass, things like that here in the foreground area, just to have a little bit more variation there, because the foreground does need to be a bit more detailed in the background. As for the surface of the water, I need a sufficient amount of value, even though it is lighter than both sides of the bank around it. And I also want to have some of these objects above the water reflected in the water. So I'm going to draw this tree, or this tree trunk, and I'm going to draw some of the bushes. Those are also going to be reflected in the surface of the water. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm trying to match some of the shapes roughly in terms of their position and the amount of value. And then the bottom part of that surface of the water will be the lightest because it's reflecting the sky above. So I think that if I can create a nice smooth transition there, the surface of the water will look pretty realistic, and then maybe I can throw in a few ripples here and there and a few more reflections, and the water will look a lot better. So I'm doing that here with the grass. I'm drawing some blades of grass growing next to the water, and I'm kind of immediately drawing some of the reflections for them, and the reflections have to match the position of these blades of grass or the objects above the water. I'm trying to smear those reflections down a little bit so that they look more like images, like reflections distorted by the water. Also adding some random details to the surface of the water, like maybe some stones and things like that, and a few ripples here and there around some places. A few blades of grass sticking out of the water, and of course you always gotta draw them in such a way so that they look like they have a reflection under them. They can't be perfect, but you want to try to make the reflection look like it's a mirror image of that blade of grass. But like I said, you can't really get every detail right. But with just a few of these suggestions, you can create something that kind of looks like the surface of the water, as long as the reflections are more or less in their place, as long as you have a few of those ripples and things like that, it'll look good enough. And of course this whole foreground area will be mostly dark. I'm just going to blend that with my finger, soften it a little bit, then add a few more details, a few more touches with either a pencil or a piece of willow charcoal, whatever I feel is more useful at that moment or at that particular place. I'm also going to add a few more branches, a few more details here and there, and just to have more trees and more foliage, I suppose, so that it looks like an actual forest. And a little bit more work on this surface of the water. I need to have that bottom part of the water a little bit lighter. And finally, I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner. I drew that with my eraser. And maybe just a few more branches with a charcoal pencil. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process and I hope you found it useful. Check out my other videos. Lots of landscapes on my channel. And if you want to see full-length narrated videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye.